Amen. In case you hadn't noticed, it's Valentine's Day, and I wanted to do a sermon series on relationships. The problem is, you may not have figured it out yet, but I don't think like most other people do. Oh, no. Surprise! And like a good pastor, I've read a lot of books on relationships because people come to the pastor with problems in their relationships. And I really didn't like any of these books on relationships because they kept saying, you have to change this and you have to do that differently and you have to be this way or that way. You have to do all this work to be good at relationships. And so I began thinking to myself, since I'm such a lazy person, why can't the bad things that we already do be used to make good relationships? And so I thought more about that, and one day I was reading through the Sermon on the Mount, and I discovered probably the first theologian in the history of the world to do so. I discovered that right there in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus shows us that there's lots of bad things that can make good relationships. So this morning we're going to talk about anger. And we're going to discover how anger can be a positive thing for relationships. Before we begin, though, I think there's a couple of misperceptions about anger. I think the first misperception about anger is that anger is a negative in relationships. And you say, Keith, well, of course anger is a negative in relationships. I've seen people, they get mad at each other and they start fighting, and the fighting gets worse, and before you know it, they're divorced, or they're not speaking with their children, or they haven't spoken with their neighbors. Anger just destroys relationships. Well, I disagree. You see, we all struggle with anger. The psychologists say that the average American person struggles with anger about 6 times a week. I don't know about you, but that seems a little low to me. Maybe I'm just not average. There was a father who wanted to show his young daughter the difference between frustration and rage. And so he called her into the kitchen where they had a speakerphone on the wall, and he said, Melinda, I want to show you the difference between frustration and rage. And he took out the phone book and he opened it up to any random number, and he put his finger down and he pushed the speakerphone button and he dialed the number in. And the gentleman on the other end answered and said, hello. And the father said, hello, is Melinda there? I have a message for her. And the gentleman said, no, I'm sorry, there's no one here named Melinda. I think you have the wrong number. Try redialing. And the father said, oh, I'm sorry. And he hung up the phone. And he said, now, Melinda, I want to show you frustration. And he pushed the speakerphone on the button, and he pushed the redial button, and the gentleman on the other end answered and said, hello. And he said, hello, is Melinda there? I have a message for her. And the guy on the other end of the line said, look, I told you there's no Melinda here. Please stop calling and bothering me. And he hung up the phone. And the father looked at his young daughter and he said, and now, Melinda, I want to show you what rage is. And he pushed the speakerphone button and he pushed the redial button, and the guy on the other end said, hello. And he said, is Melinda there? I have a message for her. And the guy said, look, I told you there's nobody here named Melinda. Stop calling and bothering me. And he slammed the phone down. And he said, now, Melinda, I'm going to push the speakerphone button and the redial button again, and I want you to say, hello, this is Melinda. Are there any messages for me? You see, we all experience anger, but it's difficult to know how to use it in a positive way. I think the other misperception that especially we Christians have about anger is that anger is a sin. But James says, be slow to become angry. He doesn't say, don't become angry. And Paul says, don't use your anger in sin. In the Message, it says, don't use your anger as a fuel for revenge. Many believe that the Bible says anger is a sin, but they're wrong. You see, the problem is that in several places in the Old Testament, it talks about God being angry, especially at the children of Israel. In fact, in a couple of places, it says God's anger burned against the children of Israel. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty angry to me. And if my theology is correct, I don't believe that God can sin. So if God is angry, then anger can't be a sin. A little closer to home, we have several examples in the New Testament where Jesus gets angry. One we're all familiar with is when he went in the temple and they were exchanging money for doves, and he got mad and he overturned the money changers' tables and he said, "You've turned my Father's house into a den of thieves," and he chased them all out. In Matthew, it says he used a whip. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty angry to me. If anger were a sin, then God couldn't get angry. The scripture talks about a righteous indignation we need to have against injustice. We need to be angry and not sin. We need to be slow to become angry, but the scriptures do not say that anger is a sin. The problem is how we handle our anger. So let's look at handling anger from a scriptural perspective and see how we might appropriately handle our anger. You see, for most of us, we think that we can handle anger better than anybody else. Oh yeah, I get angry, but I'm under control. But man, you should see my wife. When I was in college, I took a psychology class, and we did this experiment to discover things about anger. And we set up the experiment this way. We found one of the busiest intersections in Tacoma, Washington, and we put a woman in a car, and when she came up to the red light, she would stop, but when the red light turned green, she would just sit there. And as a class, we recorded the people's reactions. And you know how, when it wasn't very long before, people would go, "Hey, you idiot, it's the long, skinny pedal on the right." The next day, we did that experiment again, but we did it just a little bit differently. Instead of putting a woman in a car, we went to the same intersection at about the same time, but instead of a woman in a car, we had a very large gentleman. And the very large gentleman had long hair and a beard, and he had on a Levi's jacket with the sleeves torn off, and he had big, huge arms with tattoos, and on the back of his jacket it said Hell's Angels, and instead of being in a car, he was on a giant Harley chopper. And he pulled up to the red light, and he stopped, and when the light turned green, he just sat there, and the people in the cars behind went, "Gee, I wonder if that gentleman has something wrong with his motorcycle." What we discovered was that anger is circumstantial. Anger is circumstantial. We can choose how we respond in situations of anger. We can choose who gets the brunt of our displays of anger. And one of the things we discovered is that the more comfortable we are with the situation, the more likely we are to express our anger. The tragedy is that we are usually most comfortable at home, and the ones who receive the brunt of our anger are those we care about most. So often it's very little things that make us angry at home. They build up over time, and the next thing you know, we're exploding. These little things can grate on us, and they can ruin relationships because of our anger. Please understand, folks, that anger in and of itself is not a sin. Jesus' warning in this Matthew chapter 5 passage is about what we do with our anger. Destructive language is damaging to relationships. So, how can we use our anger to be helpful in relationships? There are 3 steps, I believe, that Jesus outlines in this Matthew 5 passage that will help us to use anger as a positive thing in our relationships. The first thing we need to do to have positive use of anger in our relationships is we need to stop and take a minute. We need to stop and take a minute. When we get angry, we need to count to 10 or take a cold shower or do whatever it is you need to do to stop and take a minute. Proverbs says, "A fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control." Our first response should be to pause rather than to unload. We need to pause rather than unload. You say, "Oh, no, I'm not that way. I need to express myself. I need to get that anger out there so I can deal with it. I need to let it all out. I'm not good at hiding it." But what happens? You've all experienced it. You're screaming and yelling, and you're fighting with one another, and there's things going back and forth across the room, and everybody's upset, and the phone rings, and you say, "Hello?" venting and loading on loved ones is not a healthy process. We need to understand that our anger is circumstantial. The problem is that in our society, we tend to value people who are honest and upright, who are forthright and say exactly what they feel, and you always go, wait, I like that guy, he's always right up front and honest. The problem is that C.S. Lewis tells us that beware of your virtues, for found within them are also your vices. When honesty is destructive in relationships, it's not helpful. When it brings pain and brutalizes others, it isn't a virtue. And what Jesus is telling us in Matthew 5 is that we need to stop and take a minute. We need to be careful about what we say in anger. We need to stop and take a minute. And then second, we need to take a look. Stop and take a minute and then take a look. We need to look deep within ourselves and find the source of the anger. On your outline is a continuum that says leaky radiator on one side and S&H green stamps on the other. Some of us are kind of like savers of S&H green stamps when it comes to our anger. When I was a kid, I used to love saving S&H green stamps. When Mom would come back from the store after looking for the candy, the second thing I looked for was the S&H green stamps. And you'd take them and you'd pull out a sponge because you didn't want to lick them because they tasted terrible. And some stores would give 4, 5, and 6 times the regular amount. So you could put them in the books and you'd save up the books, and pretty soon you'd have a big stack of them, and they had those wonderful catalogs that had bicycles and footballs and all kinds of cool stuff in it. Of course, Mom always wanted a toaster oven. But when you got enough of these stacks of books, you would take them to the S&H Green Stamps Redemption Center. And you'd put them up on the counter, and you'd come home with a beautiful toaster oven. Some of us are like savers of S&H green stamps. We save all that anger up until it's time to go to the Redemption Center and we explode like a volcano. Not all of us are like savers of S&H green stamps. Some of us are kind of like a leaky radiator. Have you ever had a leaky radiator in your car? It leaves a little green spot here and a little green spot there. It doesn't ever really explode. It just kind of makes a mess everywhere. Some of us in our anger are like leaky radiators. We never really explode, but we leave a little mess here with a snide comment, and we leave a little mess there with a little cruel act. Well, on your continuum, I want you to mark an X where you fall. Are you a saver of S&H green stamps, or are you a leaky radiator? No, don't mark it on your husband's outline, just your own. You see, it helps to say to yourself, I'm angry because. Anger is a secondary emotion, not a primary emotion. Anger is a secondary emotion. Let me explain it to you like this. My son Ryan is here today. When Ryan was about 3 years old, I worked at a church in Folsom, California, and the sanctuary was pretty close to the parking lot. And every Sunday morning, after Ryan would go to Sunday school, his mom would bring the boys up, and Ryan would give me a big hug, and then he would head straight for the parking lot. And he was just short enough that you couldn't see him over the hood ornament on your car. And when Ryan would run straight for the parking lot, I would say, "Excuse me, Ryan, that's not a good choice." Yeah, right. I'd say, "Hey, come back here, you little snot, watch out for him." The primary emotion there is not anger. The primary emotion is fear. Let me give you another example. You find yourself coming home at about 7:15 when you were supposed to be home at 6 o'clock, and you come through the door to that wonderful marital greeting, "Where the heck have you been?" And you think to yourself, well, I could have called and got yelled at twice, or I could just come home late and get yelled at once. You see, the primary emotion there is not anger. The primary emotion there is feeling unimportant, feeling left out, that you couldn't even call to let me know you were going to be late. We need to stop and take a minute and then take a look to discover what that primary emotion is underneath the anger. You see, the real issue is the feeling below the anger. Next time you're angry, stop and ask yourself, if I wasn't angry, what would I be feeling? That's the primary emotion. And if we can begin to think about what that primary emotion is, then we can begin to find help for our relationships. Anger is like a giant red flag that says, something's going on here. And if we can step outside of our anger and discover what that primary emotion is, whether it's feeling hurt or overlooked or abused or violated or misunderstood or mistreated, then we can begin to find out what the real issue is, and we can begin to solve problems. We need to stop and reflect on our real feelings instead of lashing out. So first we need to stop and take a minute, and then we need to stop and take a look. And third, we need to take a risk. We need to share that real feeling below the anger with our loved one. Anger can be helpful if we calm down and find the real feeling and share it, but there's a problem. It's a risk to share that real feeling because if I'm angry, I can just disconnect from my anger. Well, I was just angry. And everybody goes, oh yeah, he was just angry. That's okay. But if I say to you, look, I was angry because I was feeling neglected. You can say, well, that's stupid. What are you feeling neglected for? Of course we love you. Now you've not attacked my anger, you've attacked my real feeling. And that's a risk. If we can take that risk, though, and share what the real feeling is, then we can begin to work on our anger. It's important that we understand this difference because we have a lot of anger management classes, but we don't have classes on those real emotions. And those are the real cause of the problem. Anger can become a positive for relationships when we use it to discover what the real issue is. So what's Jesus' real message about anger? It has very little to do with being angry, but it has everything to do with what we do with our anger. Jesus' real message about anger is that our words can destroy us just as much or more than our actions. Our society is increasingly interested in calming the violence that we find in our neighborhoods and in our cities and in our states and in our nation. Every election year, it seems like there's some new ideas about how we can minimize the violence that we find around us. And some folks vote primarily with these issues in mind. In fact, especially in local elections, people use that as their primary motivation for who they vote for. But as a pastor, I'm concerned with more than just the violence that happens in our communities. I'm concerned about the violence that happens in our own homes. And I'm not just talking about physical violence. I'm talking about emotional violence and verbal violence that happens. It can be incredibly destructive to our families and to our relationships. You can have a 7-day waiting period become a law for buying a gun. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a 7-day waiting period before we could use our tongue? You see, it's the unleashing of anger that destroys our relationships. The unleashing of this anger is what causes us to sin. I found a wonderful translation of that Ephesians 4 passage. It says like this: go ahead and be angry, but don't use your anger as fuel for revenge. Anger can be helpful if we calm down, find the real feeling, and share it. We need to take a minute. We need to cool off. We need to think before we yell. And while we're thinking, we need to take a look and discover what the real emotion that we're feeling is. And then we need to take a risk and share that primary emotion with those we love.